In recent days, a number of publications have appeared in the media about possible, almost direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, and, moreover, Geneva is called a platform that could suit both sides. Is it so? Is Moscow ready for such a scenario? Thank you. Well, rumors are rumors. Everyone understands that it is not Ukraine that will decide when to stop and start talking seriously about realistic conditions for ending this conflict. Of course, this presupposes a renunciation of Nazi ideology, a renunciation of Nazi rhetoric, a renunciation of racism towards everything Russian, and a refusal to join NATO. These are not some sky-high dreams. These are mandatory conditions for preserving the Ukrainian people as independent, having their own identity, and not carrying out someone's orders to bring Russia into a turbulent state. I will say so. No, of course. We need to talk about this with the West. We have already mentioned today how in April 2022 the West prohibited Ukraine from signing agreements. In the same way, the West is not interested in any negotiations starting now. Washington is definitely giving the order, and, by the way, if I remember correctly, in Davos Blinken said that now he does not see even a close prospect of negotiations not only on a settlement, but also on a long-term truce in Ukraine. They don't want to talk about a settlement at all. Sometimes, according to Freud, they come up with the topic of declaring a truce in order to pump up Ukraine with weapons. This is the same way they used the Minsk agreements. You know, recently, in the same Davos, Zelensky spoke in detail, with expression, but not as vividly as in his Shokvartal 95, about the Minsk agreements. He accused Russia and President Putin personally of the fact that Putin and Russia stole 13 years of peace from the world. He directly stated that after 2014, naturally, then everything was started by the Moscow regime, as they say. There was no coup. But immediately there was the so-called annexation of Crimea. Well, they turn everything upside down. He said that after 2014, Germany and France tried hard, that they agreed on an interim solution in the form of the Minsk agreements. And Putin allegedly ruined everything. It's amazing that this man can say things like this without shame. Everyone is well aware, firstly, that the Minsk agreements were not an intermediate stage. They assumed the final closure of this problem, and they were approved by the UN Security Council. Secondly, these Minsk agreements, as you know, were not destroyed by Putin, and Merkel and Holland did not try to make them work. They both admitted that they signed these agreements only to gain time and prepare Ukraine for war. These are obvious facts that have been heard in the public space many times. They were analyzed, discussed, and commented on by many politicians and journalists, but Zelensky, without shame, simply lies to the world community from the rostrum of that same World Economic Forum in Davos. Therefore, how can we talk to such people? Moreover, his decree prohibiting negotiations with Russia has not yet been cancelled. President Putin, commenting on this topic a couple of times, said that first they should cancel the decree, and then we will see. Hello, Sergei Viktorovich, dear Maria Vladimirovna. Am I not dear? You are all dear. During the Cold War, many difficult issues were resolved by Soviet diplomacy. We can say that the second round of the Cold War is now underway. The largest NATO exercises are taking place, including on the border with Belarus. These maneuvers are seen by the West as a key part of demonstrating to Moscow the alliance's readiness for war. Questions arise: how will Russia and Belarus deter NATO aggression? How will diplomats from Russia and Belarus act? Is it now possible to somehow mitigate this conflict diplomatically? Thank you. Of course. God forbid this happens. But if suicidal logic prevails in the West, then I assure you that the Russian and Belarusian peoples will defend their independence and their interests shoulder to shoulder. There is no doubt about it. We have all the necessary means for this. And about diplomacy, I have already commented on the situation with Russian-American relations in the context of the Strategic Offensive Arms Treaty. I don't see any place for diplomacy here. When they contact us, we respond. But depending on what they offer, we look at whether it is in our interests or not. I'll give you an example. One of the large European non-English speaking countries invited our ambassador to the foreign ministry, and they began to tell him that, of course, our relations are bad and they are unlikely to improve. But Russia has strengthened its position in Africa, in the Central African Republic, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, in Chad, and their positions there have weakened. Let's meet and discuss how we can do something together here. I am not kidding. This is off-scale cynicism. You remain our enemy. We will vilify you in public space with all other possible methods, but in Africa, you will somehow help us strengthen our positions there in some way. There will never be such negotiations. Americans do the same. I have already quoted. They said, let's talk about the New START treaty. We will inspect you on a reciprocal basis. We understand that everything else with us is generally darkness in the bottom. But let everything remain as it is. Let us criticize each other. Let us attack each other. But we would like to talk about inspections of Russian nuclear facilities. Well, what are the Americans counting on? I have always assumed that smart people work in diplomatic institutions, but it doesn't always work out that way. Anticipating something similar to what you just asked, I took with me a manual that our friends from the countries of the European Union gave us. It is about how to behave with Russian diplomats. In every capital where there is a representative office of the European Union and a Russian embassy, this manual is widespread, and they must strictly follow it. European diplomats should avoid bilateral contacts with Russian representatives. Attending any events organized by the Russian side is excluded. This rule also applies to festive receptions on the occasion of November 4, February 10. This is Diplomats' Day, February 23, May 9. I draw your attention to the issue of the fight against Nazism. Victory in World War II cannot be celebrated, and June 12 is Russia Day. Further, Russian diplomats cannot be invited to events and receptions organized by the governing structures and missions of the European Union, as well as the ministries of foreign affairs of EU states. The presence at events of third countries in which the Russian side is expected to participate is not prohibited for European diplomats. Well, thank God, participation in general photography conducted by the organizers is possible. This is very generous. At the same time, you should refrain from direct contacts with representatives of Russia. It is advisable to inform the receiving party in advance about the need to avoid the close proximity of the European and Russian delegations in general photos and at official meetings. This is the answer to the question of how we assess the prospects for negotiations. We are not allowed to take pictures together, but the fact that they pay a lot of attention to photographs is true. Now the main consequence of the success of the Davos meeting on the topic of Ukraine, as they are trying to present it, is that there were more people taking pictures than at the previous meeting. These are the criteria by which Western diplomacy evaluates its efforts.